Everyone in Chicago's shadow world had learned to lower their eyes whenever Camilla Renault swept into a room, because the boss's fiancée collected fear the way other women collected diamonds, and anyone who crossed her lost their job, their dignity, and sometimes a great deal more. She was tall and razor-thin, beautiful in that cold, cutting way that made you feel small just by standing near her, and she called the working people who scrubbed the floors of the Castellano Hotel nothing more than furniture that happened to walk. Nobody dared speak back to her. Not the waiters, not the guards, not even the men who made a living carrying guns. Nobody, that is, until a weary night janitor named Della Marsh stepped straight into her path. Della was in her late 20s, thin and worn down to sharp angles from years of skipped meals and endless back-to-back shifts, with hollow cheeks, tired brown eyes that seemed too large for her drawn face, rough hands cracked from cleaning chemicals, and a tiny pair of knitted baby shoes she carried in her coat pocket everywhere she went, though she'd never told a single soul why. She'd taken the graveyard shift at the Castellano because it paid better than anything else in the city, and she needed that money more than she needed sleep, more than she needed her own pride, because a countdown clock was ticking away on the fate of the only family she had left in this world. So when Camilla backed a trembling young busboy against the wall over a single spilled glass of wine and raised her hand to make an example of him in front of the entire room, Della didn't stop to weigh the cost. She simply moved. And the man who ran that whole empire, Rourke Castellano, a man in his mid-30s with eyes the color of cold steel, a jaw scarred by a life nobody walks away from clean, and a silence that made hardened men sweat, turned and saw her for the very first time. What he couldn't have known, what none of them knew, was that this invisible woman with the cracked hands would soon unlock a truth capable of shattering his entire world, and that the quietest person in the building was the only one who truly saw everything. If a story about an underestimated woman who refuses to break speaks to your heart, tap that like button, share it with someone who loves an underdog, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now let's go back to the night when it all began. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath. The air thickened, growing so heavy that people could hear the candles crackling softly on their brass stands. Camilla still held one hand suspended in midair, her perfectly manicured nails trembling with rage abruptly restrained, while her gaze shifted from the cowering busboy to the thin woman who had dared step between them. Then a voice sounded, deep and quiet enough that it should have been swallowed by the commotion, yet it cut through everything like a blade slicing silk. Enough. Only one word, nothing more, but the entire room immediately fell still. Rourke Castellano emerged from the shadows near the staircase, moving with slow, unhurried steps, the kind of walk belonging to a man who knew the whole world would wait for him. Camilla spun around, and a crack of confusion briefly appeared across her cold, sharp face. Rourke, this girl dared talk back to me. She's nothing but a floor scrubber. He didn't look at her. His steel-colored eyes passed over the busboy pressed against the wall, over the pool of wine spreading across the marble floor, and finally settled on Della. Lower your hand, he said to Camilla, still without looking at her, and his voice didn't rise in the slightest. Yet there was something in it that made every guard standing nearby lower his eyes at once. Camilla slowly let her hand fall, her fingers curling tightly into a fist. Rourke turned toward the crowd, gathered like ravens waiting over a body. Anyone who has no business here should leave. He didn't have to say it twice. The guests, the employees, even the most curious among them, scattered like water pulling away from a sandy shore, leaving only a handful of figures in the vast hall. Rourke looked toward the young busboy, a boy barely old enough to be allowed to work the night shift, named Owen, whose face was still pale with fear. "What's your name?" he asked. The boy stammered for several moments before he managed to say it. Rourke gave a slight nod. "Go home, Owen. Your shift is over for tonight. Come back tomorrow and work as usual." The boy stared at him in bewilderment, as though he couldn't believe what he was hearing, then bowed repeatedly in gratitude and disappeared through the door leading down to the kitchen, leaving behind the hurried footsteps of someone who had just escaped something he hadn't yet fully understood. Now only Rourke, Della, Camilla, standing several steps away with her face darkened by fury, and Sal, the quiet older man who always stood behind his employer like a shadow, remained in the hall. Rourke stepped forward until he stood directly in front of Della. He was so tall that she had to lift her chin slightly, and she realized that standing close to him didn't bring the cutting cold she felt near Camilla, but rather a silent pressure, like standing before an enormous stone and having no idea what lay hidden inside it. "Do you know who you just argued with?" he asked, his voice carrying no anger, only a cold curiosity, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle unlike any he had encountered in years. Della raised her eyes and looked directly into those steel-colored eyes. She should have been afraid. Her legs should have trembled, her heart should have pounded wildly, and she should have fallen to her knees and begged for mercy as so many others had done. But there was no room left inside her for fear, because it had already been filled with burdens far heavier than that. "I know," she answered, her voice hoarse but steady. "You're the man who can make me lose my job with a single frown. But that boy didn't do anything wrong. He slipped because the rug by the entrance had shifted. The same rug I've reported several times, but no one bothered to listen. If you're going to punish someone for what happened tonight, punish me, but don't touch him." For one moment, the hall fell into absolute silence. Camilla let out a low, contemptuous laugh, but Rourke raised one hand, and the sound died instantly. He studied Della longer than necessary, his gaze moving over her hollow cheeks, the cracked hands gripping the edge of her apron, and the way she kept her back straight, even though her thin body looked ready to collapse from exhaustion. There was something in that posture that made him pause, something he hadn't seen in all the years he had spent surrounded by lowered faces and bent backs. "Go back to your work," he finally said, his voice a little gentler, though only by the smallest degree. Della nodded, bent down to retrieve the bucket and mop, then quietly walked away, her worn shoes making soft slapping sounds against the stone floor. She didn't look back, so she never saw Rourke remain where he was, watching her small figure until it disappeared completely around the bend in the corridor. Camilla strode toward him, her voice hissing through clenched teeth. "You just let a servant speak to you like that in front of everyone." Rourke didn't answer. He merely tilted his head slightly toward Sal, and the older man stepped closer without a word. "That woman," Rourke said, his voice low enough for only the two of them to hear. "Find out everything about her. Where she came from, who she lives with, why she took this job, everything." Sal gave a single nod and asked no questions, because after all those years standing behind his employer, he had learned that whenever Rourke began paying attention to someone, there was always a reason, even when Rourke himself couldn't yet give that reason a name. That night, after the building had fallen into silence, Rourke stood beside the towering window and looked down at the city glittering with lights, while the image of a thin woman with cracked hands kept returning to him, a woman who had dared stand against the fury feared by the entire underworld, simply to protect a boy she had never even spoken to before. He didn't yet know that the night was only the beginning, or that the woman with those weathered hands was about to step into his life carrying truths he had buried for years. The sky had faded into the ashen gray of approaching dawn when Della stepped off the last bus, pulling the collar of her thin coat higher around her neck against the skin-cutting wind sweeping down the deserted street. The neighborhood where she lived lay in a corner of the city where the streetlights flickered on and off, where old apartment buildings crowded together like weary elderly people, leaning against one another to keep from falling. She climbed several flights of dark stairs on foot, her cracked hand tracing the freezing railing, every step heavy, as though lead had been fastened to her feet. But when she reached the door of her tiny apartment, something inside her chest softened. She quietly turned the key, careful not to make a sound, and pushed the door open. The room beyond was cramped and shabby, with wallpaper peeling away in patches and an old heater wheezing weakly. But it was warm, and for Della, warmth alone was enough. Beneath the faint glow of the nightlight in the corner, she saw that Toby was still awake, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the bed, his head bowed in deep concentration over something spread out before him. The 14-year-old boy was thin like his sister, with tangled hair falling across his forehead, and his small hands were moving glass marbles over the floor with absolute focus, the kind of focus that belonged only to him. "I'm home, Toby," Della called softly, her voice becoming instantly gentler, completely unlike the steady voice she had used to face the crime boss only hours earlier. Toby didn't look up and didn't speak, because he had never spoken with words in the way people were accustomed to, but his shoulders relaxed slightly, and his fingers paused for a single beat. That was his way of letting his sister know he had heard her, that he knew she had come home. Della removed her coat, damp with mist, hung it on the nail behind the door, then gently lowered herself onto the floor beside him, paying no attention to her aching legs or the dull pain spreading across her back. Before Toby lay glass marbles in every color, inexpensive toys she had gathered for him little by little over the years, and he was arranging them into neat rows, blue beside blue, red beside red, yellow resting perfectly beside yellow, a flawless order that existed only in his private world. Della didn't disturb that order. She simply picked up a blue marble that had become mixed among the red ones and returned it to its proper row. And this time, Toby lifted his eyes to her. Their gazes met for one brief moment, and then the corners of the boy's mouth curved into a smile, a clear and unburdened smile, the kind Della would have traded the whole world to see every day. She reached out and gently smoothed his tangled hair, and inside her, every humiliation, every exhaustion, every contemptuous glance she had swallowed through the long night suddenly became lighter, as though none of it had ever existed. This was why she endured everything. This was why she lowered her head, clenched her teeth, scrubbed the endless corridors again and again, and listened to cruel words without answering back. Toby was all she had left, the only fragment of family that remained after life had taken everything else from her one piece at a time, and she had promised herself that even if she had to kneel before the entire world, she would never allow anyone to take him away. The two of them remained there together in silence, the warm kind of silence that needed no words, sorting the marbles by color until Toby's eyelids began to grow heavy. Della helped him into bed, pulled the thin blanket over his body, and stayed seated on the edge of the mattress until his breathing became slow and even. On the small shelf beside the bed, beneath the weak yellow light of the night lamp, rested a tiny pair of children's knitted shoes, placed neatly together, the shoes she touched once every night before sleeping, a habit woven so deeply into her flesh and blood that it had become a silent ritual she performed without thought, as naturally as breathing. She touched them tonight, as she did every night, then drew her hand back, and her gaze accidentally fell upon the unsteady wooden table against the wall, where a letter had been lying for several days, a letter she still hadn't found the courage to open for a second time. She had already read it. She had read it until she knew every cold sentence printed on the paper bearing the seal of the Child Welfare Agency, and each time she remembered those words, her heart tightened painfully. They said that under her current circumstances, with this run-down apartment, her uncertain wages, and their difficult living conditions, she was no longer considered fit to remain Toby's caregiver. They had given her a period of time, only 2 months, to prove that she could provide him with stable housing and a decent life. Otherwise, they would place him in a state-run facility. Della clenched both hands in her lap, feeling each crack in her skin sting sharply. The clock had begun counting down, and every passing day brought her closer to the thing she feared more than anything in the world, watching strangers carry away the last piece of her family. It was because of that invisible clock ticking above her life that she had accepted the job at the Castellano Hotel, a place that paid her an amount of money so unreasonably high that she knew it concealed things no ordinary person should ever become involved in. But she was no longer an ordinary person, with the luxury of choosing. She looked at her younger brother's peaceful sleeping face, bent down to place a gentle kiss on his forehead, and whispered into the darkness a promise only she could hear, that no matter what price she had to pay, she would keep him beside her. A few days later, on an evening when the Chicago sky was covered by clouds as heavy as lead, the Castellano Hotel still blazed with elegant light on the floors reserved for guests. But deep below, in the basement where ordinary employees were never permitted to set foot, something very different was unfolding. Through a bitter twist of chance, Della had been assigned to clean the corridor leading down to that level, and as she quietly pushed her supply cart around a corner, she heard voices drifting from a partially open door. She stopped, and she should have turned away. She should have remembered the unspoken rule everyone there knew by heart. Keep your head down. Don't look, don't listen, don't see. But there was something in the deep, cold voice coming through the doorway that seemed to fasten her feet to the floor. Through the narrow opening, she saw Rourke standing with his hands in his trouser pockets, his posture straight and so still that it was frightening, facing a man who had collapsed to his knees on the concrete floor and was trembling too violently to speak. "I gave you everything," Rourke said, his voice never rising, carrying no trace of anger, and it was that very calmness that sent a chill down the spine. "I brought you into my home when no one else would take you in. I trusted you, and you sold that trust to someone else." The man kneeling on the floor began to weep, begging in broken phrases, swearing that he had been forced, that his family had been threatened, that he had been left with no other choice. Rourke listened to every word in silence without interrupting, and in that silence was a terrible authority more powerful than any scream. Then he tilted his head slightly toward Sal, who stood quietly beside him, offering only the smallest nod, and the other men in the room stepped forward, helped the traitor to his feet, and led him away through another door. There was no gunshot, No blood, none of the things people usually imagined. Only a cold finality, and it was that quiet absence of violence that made Della shudder. She pressed herself against the wall in the darkness, her heart pounding, and for the first time since she had entered that place, she truly understood who she was working for. The man who had once softened his voice and told her to return to her duties, the man with steel-colored eyes who had studied her longer than necessary, was also the man who could decide another person's fate with the slightest nod. She quickly turned the cart around and pushed it back the way she had come, trying to make every step as quiet as possible. But the image of what she had just witnessed kept echoing through her mind, and a vague unease began to creep into her heart. Inside the room, after everyone else had left, only Rourke and Sal remained. Rourke walked to the small window overlooking the dark courtyard, and for one brief moment, his rigid, commanding posture seemed to sag, only slightly, but enough for Sal, who had stood behind him for so many years, to notice. "He has a family," Rourke said quietly without turning around, his voice carrying a tone Sal rarely heard. "A wife, several children." Sal remained silent for a moment before answering in the deep, measured voice of a man who had witnessed too much. "You gave him a chance. He chose his own path." Rourke didn't respond immediately. He stood there looking into the night, his fingers tightening and then slowly relaxing. "I know," he finally said, "but some nights, Sal, I wonder whether I can still tell the difference between what has to be done and what I want to do. That line is becoming harder and harder for me to see." Sal looked at his employer, the man feared by the entire criminal underworld of the city, and something almost like sorrow passed through his aged eyes. But he said nothing more, because he understood that some burdens had to be carried alone, and some old wounds could never heal, no matter how much time passed. Rourke turned back, and within an instant, his face had returned to its familiar cold composure, as though that brief moment of weakness had never existed. "What about that woman?" he asked, changing his tone. "How far have you gotten?" Sal frowned slightly. "Almost finished, but there are a few things, sir, that I think you should read for yourself." Something in the way Sal spoke made Rourke look up, a searching expression passing briefly across his face, but he asked no further questions. He simply nodded and told Sal to prepare the file and leave it for him. That night, after Della returned to her work on the upper floors, her hands were still trembling as she wrung out the cleaning cloth, and she couldn't drive the image of the man standing silently in that basement room from her mind. She realized that the world she had entered was unlike anything she had ever known, that beneath the glittering surface of this five-star hotel lay dark rules she didn't understand, and that the man who ruled this place could be as cold as ice, yet still carried something in his eyes she couldn't explain. She didn't know that before long, she would be the one to touch that mystery, and that their two lives, which seemed to have nothing in common, would be bound tightly together by a truth buried long ago. That weekend, Della was assigned to clean a room she had never entered before, an old storage room at the end of a deserted corridor on one of the upper floors, where towering shelves were crowded with dusty files and cardboard boxes filled with documents yellowed by the passing years. The air inside was thick with the smell of decaying paper and dust, while the weak yellow light cast long, twisted shadows across the floor beneath the rows of shelves rising high above her. Della worked quietly, wiping each surface and brushing dust from the stacks of records, and she would have finished the task and gone home as she always did, if an unsteady pile of papers on a high shelf hadn't suddenly come crashing down when her hand accidentally touched it. She quickly bent to gather everything, placing the scattered pages back in order one by one, and it was then that her eyes fell upon an old file whose cover bore the name of a Castellano family freight warehouse. That name, that location, made her entire body freeze. The papers began to tremble in her hand, and for one moment, she thought her heart had stopped beating. It was the place where her mother had died. Many years earlier, when Della was still a young woman who hadn't yet understood the full cruelty of life, her mother had worked herself to exhaustion in a freight warehouse to provide for her two children, and one day, the family had been told that she had collapsed at work, an industrial accident people called an unfortunate tragedy, an incident for which no one was ever held responsible. She had left this world as quietly as she had lived in it, and her family had never received a proper explanation, never been given fair compensation. Only a cold piece of paper and a grief that lingered long after. For all those years, Della had believed the warehouse that took her mother away was some distant, faceless place, a fading name in her memory that she had tried to forget so she could keep living. She had never imagined that it belonged to the very family whose floors she now scrubbed. Fate had given her no warning. It had simply placed the truth before her in a dusty room on an ordinary evening, like a bitter joke. Della sank to the floor, clutching the file tightly against her chest, and felt a chill travel down her spine. Countless questions flooded her mind at once, but she didn't dare follow them, didn't dare open the file, because she was afraid of what she might find inside. She wasn't someone searching for the truth. She had come to this place only for the wages, only for Toby, only because of the clock counting down each remaining day over her brother's fate. Yet now the truth had come looking for her, and she knew that from that moment on, she would never be able to look at this place through the same eyes again. She carefully returned the file to its exact place on the shelf, her hands still trembling, then finished the rest of her work and left the room carrying a crushing weight inside her that she had no one to share with. The following morning, after a night spent almost entirely awake, Della went to see the only woman in the city who was still willing to listen to her, a legal aid worker named Nora Bishop, who was helping her navigate the complicated procedures involved in keeping custody of Toby. Nora's office was small and cramped, piled high with the files of other struggling people, but the middle-aged woman with salt and pepper hair and unwavering eyes possessed a warmth that made Della feel she was being seen as a human being rather than a piece of furniture that happened to walk. "You look as though you haven't slept all night," Nora said, pouring her a cup of hot tea and sliding it across the desk. Della wrapped her cracked hands around the cup, and for one brief moment, she nearly told her everything, about the file, the warehouse, the Castellano name. But then she stopped herself. She didn't yet know what she was facing, and she didn't want to pull this kind woman into something that might be dangerous. "It's only that the work has been exhausting," she replied with a strained smile. Nora studied her for a long moment with the knowing gaze of someone who had lived through enough to recognize hidden pain, then gave a slight nod and didn't press further. "Listen to me, Della," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I'll do everything I can with Toby's case, but you have to prove that you have stable housing and a reliable source of income. There isn't much time left. Don't let anything break you before we finish this. Do you understand?" Della nodded, tightening her hands around the cup of tea, and inside her, amid the confusion surrounding the truth she had just discovered, one thing remained as clear as light, that no matter what happened, she had to keep her brother. She had no idea that the Castellano name she had touched by chance would lead her far beyond anything she could imagine, or that the truth she feared had only begun to reveal its first layer. In the days that followed, Della's life at the Castellano Hotel became a succession of small torments, each one devised by Camilla with meticulous cruelty. She couldn't strike at Della openly, because Rourke's words from the night of their confrontation still hung in the air like an order even she didn't dare violate in public. But she had countless ways to turn Della's life into a living hell without ever laying a finger on her. One day, just as Della finished polishing an entire corridor until her arms ached, Camilla strolled past, deliberately knocked a glass of red wine onto the freshly gleaming marble floor, then turned and looked at her coldly, asking what kind of work she thought she was doing if the floor was still so filthy. On another day, in the middle of a lobby crowded with wealthy guests, she raised her voice so everyone could hear and delivered a string of vicious remarks about Della's impoverished background, the smell of cleaning chemicals clinging to her clothes, and how someone like her ought to exist only in the shadows instead of forcing decent people to look at her. Several guests laughed softly. A few turned away in discomfort, but no one spoke, because that was the law of this place. Della stood there with both hands clenched around the mop handle, her thin face burning red with humiliation, but she didn't answer a single word. She only lowered her head, quietly wiped away the spilled wine, and silently swallowed everything Camilla threw at her, because only one image filled her mind in those moments: Toby's peaceful sleeping face, the medicine he needed, and the clock counting down that only the wages from this place could help her fight. Every insult she swallowed bought her one more day with her brother, and she told herself that no matter how bitter the price, she could pay it. But there was one thing Camilla failed to notice in the satisfaction of her cruelty, and that was another pair of eyes quietly watching it all. From an upper balcony, from turns in the corridors, from hidden corners no one would have thought to search, Rourke witnessed those acts of torment more than once. He didn't intervene immediately, because he wanted to watch, to understand the true nature of this thin woman through the way she endured. What caught his attention wasn't her patience, because he had seen too many people who knew how to bow their heads, but what she did when she believed no one was watching. He saw her secretly press the last few coins she had into the hand of a maid who was quietly crying. He saw her take over the heaviest part of an elderly cleaner's work when the woman's back was hurting, asking for nothing in return. He saw her stop in the middle of her own exhaustion to catch a tray slipping from the hands of an awkward young waiter, then smile to reassure him instead of scolding him. Those small acts, in a place where kindness was a luxury and everyone cared only about protecting themselves, made a man who had spent too many years among schemes and betrayals stop and think. There were times when they encountered each other in deserted corridors, and each time, the air between them thickened with a tension neither could name. Once, she was wiping the staircase railing when he passed, and their eyes met by accident, holding for longer than an ordinary moment before she quickly lowered her gaze and he continued on in silence. Another time, he stopped beside her and watched the care with which she cleaned every hidden corner no one else bothered to notice, then quietly asked whether she was tired, a casual question no employer had ever asked a cleaner, leaving her staring up at him in confusion, unsure how to answer. "You don't need to concern yourself with people like me," she said softly, her voice cautious and touched with something defensive. Rourke studied her for a moment, his steel-colored eyes softening in the darkness of the corridor. "Perhaps that's the problem," he replied, his voice deep and unreadable. "People should concern themselves, but no one does." Then he walked away, leaving her standing there with a strange feeling rising in her chest. A feeling she hadn't allowed herself to have in a very long time. She told herself she couldn't pay attention to it, that this man owned the place, that he ruled the dark world she had briefly glimpsed, that he could decide a person's fate with a single nod, and that an uncrossable abyss lay between them, not to mention the cold truth she had just discovered and was still hiding inside herself. But no matter how many times she repeated those things, whenever she caught his gaze, her heart still faltered for a single beat she couldn't control. Long after midnight, when the entire hotel had fallen asleep and only the dim corridor lights remained burning, Della was still awake, sitting alone in the basement laundry room, where the silent machines stood around her and the faint scent of soap lingered in the air. Her uniform had been torn in a long line along one side of the hem, the result of an evening when Camilla had deliberately yanked it as she passed, and Della couldn't afford to buy a new one, nor did she dare ask for a replacement for fear that the cost would be taken from her wages. So she sat there beneath the weak yellow light, carefully guiding each stitch through the torn fabric, with cracked hands already aching from a long shift. But something was different tonight. Perhaps she was simply too tired, too exhausted in both body and spirit. Or perhaps the cold truth about the warehouse had been weighing on her heart for too many days. But tears kept slipping silently down her thin face and falling onto the cloth in her hands, even though she never made a sound. She cried in silence, the way someone cries after enduring so much that she no longer knows how to complain. And she had no idea that a figure had stopped in the doorway. Rourke, restless on another sleepless night like so many before it, had wandered down to the lower floors of the building, and he stopped when he saw her, the thin woman sitting alone in the cold room, quietly mending her torn uniform and quietly weeping. He didn't speak at once. He only stood there, and something inside his chest tightened at the sight. Finally, he stepped into the room, and the sound of his footsteps made her look up in alarm. She quickly wiped away her tears and rose in confusion, as though she had been caught doing something wrong. "Sir, I'm sorry. I was only repairing my uniform. I'll leave right away," she stammered. Rourke merely shook his head and motioned for her to sit. "You haven't done anything wrong," he said, his deep voice unusually gentle. He pulled over an old chair and sat across from her, leaving a respectful distance between them. And in the stillness of the laundry room before dawn, something caused the defenses she always kept around herself to begin to weaken. His gaze accidentally fell upon the pocket of her coat, where a small object was protruding, and as though she could read the unspoken question in his eyes, she slowly reached inside and drew out a tiny pair of children's knitted shoes, faded by the passing years. She placed them in her palm and looked at them with such tenderness that it brought a lump to Rourke's throat. "These belong to my daughter," she said softly, her voice trembling yet strangely calm, the calmness of a sorrow that had lived beside someone for so long that it had become part of her flesh and blood. "She was born with a weak heart. The doctors warned me that she wouldn't be able to stay with me for long, but I kept hoping. I prayed every night." She paused, gently tracing one of the little knitted shoes with a calloused finger. "She only had the chance to wear these through one winter, just one winter. Then she left me before spring had even arrived." The room sank into silence, a heavy silence no words could fill. Rourke sat there, the man feared by the entire underworld, and he couldn't find a single thing to say. because in the presence of grief like that, every word of comfort became cheap. He only watched her, watched the way she cradled those tiny shoes as though she were holding an entire world she had lost. "Since the day I lost her," Della continued, raising her eyes to meet his, and now there was a quiet, unwavering flame in those tired brown eyes. "I haven't been able to stand by and watch any child get hurt. I couldn't save my own child, sir. So whenever I see someone vulnerable about to be crushed, I can't stop myself, even when I know I'll have to pay the price. Perhaps that's the only way I can still feel useful to someone." Now Rourke understood. He understood why this thin woman had dared step between Camilla and her fury that night, why she had stood with her back straight before someone the entire room feared, simply to protect a boy she didn't know. It wasn't recklessness, and it wasn't foolishness. It was a wound transformed into courage, a loss transformed into compassion. He looked at her beneath the dim light, and for the first time in many years, something stirred within the hardened heart of that man. A quiet respect for the small but resilient person sitting before him, someone from whom life had taken nearly everything, yet who still possessed enough tenderness to feel sorrow for others. From that night in the laundry room onward, something between them changed, an invisible thread joining them that both could feel but neither dared give a name. Then, several nights later, Sal placed on Rourke's desk the file he had painstakingly compiled on the woman named Della Marsh, and as Rourke silently opened it and read beneath the late-night lamplight, his face gradually hardened. He read about her circumstances, about the younger brother she was struggling to raise, about the daughter she had lost, and then his gaze stopped on a line that turned his entire body cold. A line mentioning her mother and the freight warehouse where she had fallen many years earlier, the warehouse that bore the name of his own family. He sat motionless in the darkness for a long time, and the fragments in his mind began fitting together into a picture he didn't want to see, because he knew about that warehouse. He knew more about what had happened there than what had ever been written in the official records. The following morning, he summoned Della to his office, an enormous room with towering glass windows overlooking the entire city. She entered with her familiar caution, her hands clasped tightly together. But when she saw the unusual gravity on his face, she stopped. "Sit down," he said, and his voice carried a heaviness she had never heard before. She lowered herself onto the edge of the chair, her heart pounding, sensing that something terrible was about to come. Rourke stood beside the window with his back to her, looking down at the gray city below, and a long time passed before he finally spoke. "I know where your mother worked," he said quietly. "I know how she died." Della's body stiffened, her fingers tightening until they turned white. She had never told him about this, and the fact that he knew left her both frightened and confused. "They said it was an accident," she whispered, her voice trembling. "An unfortunate tragedy. No one was at fault." Rourke turned to face her, and in those steel-colored eyes was something almost like pain. "That's what they wanted you to believe," he said, "but the truth is different. That warehouse should have been repaired long before the accident. People knew it wasn't safe. There had been warnings, but every one of them was ignored because repairs would have cost money. And when the accident happened, when your mother and several others lost their lives, instead of accepting responsibility and properly compensating the families who had lost the people they loved, those in power used money and influence to cover everything up. They turned deadly negligence into a random accident on paper so no one would be held accountable, and the whole matter would disappear into silence." Every word he spoke cut into Della's heart like a blade. She sat there in stunned silence as tears began slipping quietly down her face. For all those years, she had lived believing that her mother's death had been nothing more than cruel fate, something no one could have prevented, and now she was learning that her mother had died unjustly, that she might still have been alive if the people in power hadn't chosen money over human life. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice breaking. Rourke remained silent for a long moment, then did something no one had ever seen him do. He sat down in the chair across from her, placing himself at the same level as she was. And in that moment, the most powerful man in the underworld looked like nothing more than a human being carrying old wounds inside him. "Because I understand that feeling," he said softly. "The feeling of having this world take away the person you love most while you're powerless to stop it. My mother was also taken from me because of the very world I now rule. I was too young when it happened, too young to protect her, and too weak to demand justice. I grew up in a world that taught me the strong had the right to crush the weak, that compassion was a sign of weakness. But there's one thing I have never been able to accept and never will: cruelty inflicted merely for pleasure, brutality against people who have no way to defend themselves. He raised his eyes to hers, and their gazes met, two people from worlds as distant as heaven and earth, yet bound together by the same wound, the same loss, the same sorrow that fate had cruelly woven into both their lives. Della looked at the man sitting before her, and for the first time, she no longer saw the frightening crime boss. She saw a lonely soul who had once been broken by life in exactly the same way she had. Not long afterward, the entire Castellano Hotel was bustling with preparations for a grand charity gala, a lavish event where the city's elite and most powerful figures would gather, where expensive gowns would sweep past one another beneath crystal lights, and polite smiles would conceal countless schemes. For Camilla, it was the perfect opportunity. She had been quietly feeding her hatred ever since the night Rourke stopped her hand in front of everyone, and she had begun to notice that her fiancé's eyes now followed the thin cleaning woman instead of her. Unable to strike directly, she chose another method, one far more subtle and cruel. She would turn Della into a spectacle before the whole of high society, stripping away her dignity until nothing remained. She arranged for Della to serve at the gala, then deliberately had someone deliver a specially prepared uniform for her, a cheap garment made from gaudy, shiny fabric, clumsily tailored and intentionally too tight, a ridiculous costume designed to make whoever wore it look pitiful and absurd among the elegant crowd. When Della received the outfit in the employees' changing room, she immediately understood that it was a trap. She stood before the old mirror stained with patches of age, put on the uniform, and looked at her own reflection as her heart twisted painfully. The outfit clung strangely to her thin body, while the cheap fabric caught the light in vulgar flashes, and she knew perfectly well that when she stepped among the distinguished guests, she would look like a joke, something for people to point at and laugh over. For a brief moment, the woman she had once been rose inside her again, the woman the whole world had told was worth nothing, who had bowed her head beneath every insult and wished only to disappear from everyone's sight. Her nose began to sting, and her hand trembled as she gripped the edge of the table. Part of her wanted to tear the outfit off, run from the place, abandon everything, and hide in the small apartment where she could hold Toby and forget this cruel world. But just as the tears threatened to fall, she thought of her brother's peaceful sleeping face, of the clock counting down day by day, and of the silent promise she had whispered into the darkness that she would never let him be taken from her. She also thought of something else, of the words Rourke had spoken to her in the laundry room that night, and of the eyes of a man who had also been broken by life, yet had somehow kept something human inside himself. She thought of her mother, of the woman who had died unjustly without ever receiving a single measure of justice, and she wondered whether her mother would want to see her daughter collapse because of an ugly dress and a few cruel laughs. Della drew in a deep breath, and when she lifted her eyes to the mirror again, something in her gaze had changed. Tears still shimmered at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She dried them, smoothed the cheap uniform over her body, and with a calmness slowly rising within her, reached into her bag and took out a tube of red lipstick, the only inexpensive cosmetic she owned, worn nearly down to nothing, and slowly painted her lips a deep, proud crimson. She pinned her hair neatly into place, lifted her chin, and looked directly at her own reflection. If Camilla wanted to turn her into a joke, she wouldn't give her that satisfaction. If people wanted to see a lowly woman bow her head in humiliation, what they would receive instead was a woman walking with her back straight, carrying every ounce of dignity no one could take from her. The outfit might be cheap, and her circumstances might be cruel, but the way she faced them belonged to her alone, and no Camilla in this world could ever steal that from her. She looked at herself in the mirror one final time, a thin woman with red lips and unwavering eyes, then turned, pushed open the changing room door, and stepped toward the brilliant lights of the grand hall, where an entire world was waiting to laugh at her, never suspecting that the night wouldn't unfold in the way any of them imagined. The grand ballroom of the Castellano Hotel was breathtaking that night, with enormous crystal chandeliers casting golden light across the gleaming marble floor, while the graceful music of a string quartet drifted between hushed conversations and the delicate chiming of wine glasses. An entire world of privilege had gathered there, men dressed in perfectly tailored suits, women draped in silk and diamonds, all wearing the proud expressions of people accustomed to standing at the very top. And into that lavish setting stepped Della, carrying a tray of wine in her hands, dressed in the gaudy, ill-fitting uniform, her lips painted red and her head held high. At once, every gaze began turning toward her. There were quiet whispers, curled lips, and eyes that swept over her from head to toe with undisguised contempt. Several women covered their mouths as they laughed, While a few men exchanged mocking glances, Della felt every one of them, each stare piercing her skin like a needle, but she didn't lower her head. She moved through the ballroom with slow, steady steps, her eyes fixed straight ahead, quietly doing her work and placing glasses of wine into the hands of each guest, with a composure that left even those who mocked her momentarily unsettled. Standing at the center of the ballroom, surrounded by the city's most powerful people, Camilla wore a magnificent black evening gown, diamonds glittering at her neck and ears, and she had been waiting for this moment. As Della approached with the tray, Camilla suddenly raised her voice, clear and sharp enough to carry across a wide section of the room, causing the music and nearby conversations to fade. "Oh, look what we have here," she said, her lips curving into a cruel smile, and every eye immediately turned toward the thin servant. "We have always taken pride in our refined taste here, yet somehow, things like this still manage to slip through. Look at her," someone dragged up from the very bottom of the city, wrapped in cheap fabric and imagining that a little lipstick can hide the lowly place she came from. She began circling Della slowly, like a cat playing with its prey, and soft laughter spread through the ballroom. "Take a good look, ladies and gentlemen," Camilla continued, her voice growing more venomous with every word. "This is what happens when compassion is wasted on the wrong people. Someone gives women like her a job, a roof over their heads, and suddenly she imagines she has the right to lift her face and look upon people of our standing. How truly pathetic." Each word struck Della like a lash before the eyes of 100 people. Her thin face burned, humiliation rose until it tightened her throat, and for one brief moment, her eyes began to sting. The ballroom had fallen completely silent now, everyone watching, waiting to see how the small woman would collapse, how she would burst into tears, bow her head and beg, or flee in disgrace. But Della did none of those things. She straightened her back, drew in a deep breath, and although tears still shimmered in her eyes, she didn't allow a single one to fall. She looked directly at Camilla with such calmness that Camilla herself hesitated, and when Della spoke, her voice was quiet but remarkably clear and steady. "You're right, ma'am," she replied. "I did come from the very bottom of this city. I'm poor, I'm wearing cheap clothes, and my hands are cracked from cleaning. But I earn my living through honest work, and I've never had to step over anyone to reach the place where I stand. You can laugh at what I'm wearing, but all the diamonds on your body couldn't buy what I have, the right to hold my head high without feeling ashamed before my own conscience." The entire ballroom fell silent in shock. No one had expected such an answer, and on Camilla's beautiful face, the cruel smile slowly vanished, replaced by a twisted look of rage. She wasn't accustomed to being answered back, least of all by someone she considered beneath contempt, and before the eyes of 100 powerful people, the humiliation caused her fury to erupt. She stepped forward, her face hardening, her hand slowly rising, and the entire ballroom held its breath, because everyone could feel that the tension gathering all evening was about to break into something that could never be undone. Camilla's hand swept upward through the air, but it never reached Della's face, because in that very instant, another hand closed firmly around her wrist, a strong hand tightening with enough force to make her freeze. A quiet gasp rippled through the ballroom. Then everything fell silent, as every eye recognized the man who had just stepped forward, Rourke Castellano. He emerged from the crowd with a deadly calm in his stride, his face as cold as ice. Camilla spun toward him, her eyes wide with shock and fury. "Rourke, what are you doing?" she hissed, trying to wrench her arm free from his grip. "This girl dared disrespect me in front of everyone. Let go of me." But Rourke didn't release her. He looked directly into her eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was deep and quiet, yet it carried through the silent ballroom with such clarity that no one missed a single word. "I've tolerated your cruelty long enough, Camilla," he said. "I've turned a blind eye to your arrogance and viciousness for far too long, in the name of an engagement, in the name of an alliance between two families. But I won't stand here for one more second and watch you trample another person's dignity simply because you believe you have the right." Each word fell like a stone into still water, stirring shocked whispers throughout the ballroom before silence returned once more. Camilla's face drained of color. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice trembling with disbelief. "You're defending a servant? In front of my father? In front of all these people? We're engaged. Do you understand what that means?" Rourke slowly released her wrist, but his gaze never wavered. He turned and looked across the ballroom at the powerful faces staring back at him in stunned disbelief, then spoke with the finality of a man who had made his decision and would never turn back. I understand exactly what it means. It means power, money, and stability for everything I've built. But there's something else I understand even more clearly." He paused and looked toward Della, the thin woman still standing in her cheap uniform, too stunned to comprehend what was happening, then turned back to Camilla and declared in a voice that rang through the grand ballroom, "I would rather lose this entire alliance, rather surrender everything it offers, than stand by and watch a decent person be humiliated beneath my own roof. This engagement ends now." The declaration struck the ballroom like thunder beneath a clear sky. 100 powerful people stood frozen, wineglasses suspended in midair, the musicians falling silent, and for one long moment that seemed endless, no one dared draw a deep breath. What had just happened was more than the end of an engagement. It was a public severing of ties between two formidable powers, an act everyone present understood would bring consequences beyond measure. Camilla stood trembling with humiliation and rage, her beautiful face distorted by an emotion she had never experienced before, the feeling of being abandoned, of being brought down before the very world she had once ruled through fear. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice shaking yet sharpened by threat, her eyes burning with cold hatred. "You have no idea what you've just done, Rourke. My father will never let this pass. You've started a war with your own hands, one you can't possibly win." Rourke looked at her, and there wasn't the slightest trace of hesitation on his face. "Then let the war begin," he replied with a calmness that was almost frightening. Camilla looked at him one final time, her eyes flashing with the promise of revenge, then turned and strode out of the ballroom, the hem of her black gown sweeping across the marble floor like a trail of darkness, leaving behind a crowd that still hadn't recovered from the shock. Amid all that silent turmoil, Rourke walked toward Della. She looked up at him, her brown eyes wide with disbelief, and opened her mouth to say something, but no words came. He only looked at her, his steel-colored eyes now softened in a strange and unfamiliar way, and within the stunned silence of the entire ballroom, she realized that from that moment forward, her life would never be the same again. But Camilla hadn't yet taken her final steps out of the ballroom. She stopped halfway, and like a cornered animal that could do nothing but bite and tear, she spun around, her eyes flashing with a vicious light born of both desperation and hatred. If she had to leave in humiliation, she wouldn't leave alone. She would drag the beautiful moment Rourke had just created down into the mud with her. "You stand there playing the noble hero," she said, her voice now dripping with bitter mockery as her gaze bored into Della, "protecting this poor little cleaning woman as though you were an innocent man. But does she know who the man shielding her truly is? Does she know why he has been so kind to her?" Rourke frowned slightly, and something in his eyes faltered for an instant, as though he already sensed what was coming. "Camilla, enough," he said, his voice dropping into a warning, but she didn't stop. She turned toward Della, her lips curling into a cruel smile, and released the words like knives. "Do you know where your mother died, girl?" "In the warehouse that carried this family's name. And do you know who signed the papers that turned her wrongful death into an accident too insignificant to matter? Ask him yourself. Ask what the very hand protecting you today once did to your family years ago." The ballroom, already silent, seemed to fall into an even deeper stillness. Della felt as though the ground beneath her feet had collapsed. She slowly turned toward Rourke, her brown eyes wide with confusion and pleading, begging him to tell her it was nothing more than a vicious lie from someone who had lost everything. "That isn't true, is it?" she whispered, her voice trembling and breaking apart. "Tell me it isn't true." But Rourke said nothing. He only stood there, his face drained of color, and in his steel-colored eyes appeared an agony and remorse unlike anything she had ever seen. That silence answered her, and it was more merciless than any confession could have been. He didn't deny it. He couldn't deny it, because it was true. His name, the same hand she had imagined, gently wiping away her tears, the same hand that had protected her before an entire world, was also the hand that had signed the papers burying justice for her mother. Della stepped back once, then again, one hand rising to clutch her chest as though someone had struck her with a fatal blade. The tears she had restrained all evening finally broke free and streamed down her thin face. "So everything you told me," she choked out, "about understanding my pain, about your mother, about how much you despised cruelty, was all of it a lie? You knew who I was from the beginning. You knew how my mother died, and you knew that you were the one who silenced justice for her." Rourke stepped forward and reached toward her. "Della, let me explain. It isn't as simple as you think," he said, his voice breaking with urgency. but she shook her head and moved beyond his reach, her face drenched in tears while her eyes burned with hurt and fury. "Don't," she said. "Don't touch me. I don't want to hear another word." Then she turned and ran through the stunned crowd, fleeing the dazzling ballroom, fleeing the luxurious world to which she had never belonged, carrying inside her chest a heart that had just been crushed by the betrayal of the very man she had begun to trust. Behind her, Rourke stood rooted to the floor, helplessly watching her small figure disappear. And for the first time in his life, the most powerful man in the underworld felt utterly powerless. Camilla, meanwhile, stood quietly in one corner, admiring the result of her work with a cold, satisfied smile. She had planted the seed of destruction, and now that the engagement lay in ruins and her pride had been trampled, she knew exactly what she had to do next. That night, she left the Castellano Hotel and returned to her father, Vito Renaud, the powerful head of her family, carrying all her hatred and an unshakable determination to seek revenge to the very end. From that moment on, she was no longer the discarded fiancée. She had become the sharpest blade in her father's hand, ready to strike directly into Rourke's heart and everything he held dear. Della never returned to the Castellano Hotel. For the next several days, she shut herself inside the small, run-down apartment, holding Toby close and trying to regain some balance in a soul that had been fractured, but the pain wouldn't release her. Then, late one afternoon, just after she had soothed Toby to sleep, there came a quiet knock at the door. She opened it and froze when she saw Rourke standing there, not in the powerful suit he usually wore, but in a simple coat, his face marked by the exhaustion of sleepless nights. "I'm only asking for 5 minutes," he said softly. "After that, if you still want me to leave, I'll go, and I'll never trouble you again." Della was about to close the door, but something in his eyes, a desperate sincerity, made her hesitate. At last, she stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind her so she wouldn't wake her brother, then folded her arms and stood there waiting. Rourke drew in a deep breath and began to speak, his voice low and heavy. "The year those papers were signed," he said. "I had only just taken control of everything after my father died. I was young. I didn't yet understand the machinery I had inherited. And I was surrounded by experienced men who were always looking for ways to take advantage of my inexperience. They brought me stacks of papers to sign, hundreds of documents every day, and told me they were nothing more than routine formalities. I signed them without reading every line carefully because I trusted the men I believed were my advisors. I had no idea what one of those documents truly was. I didn't know it concerned the deaths of innocent people, or your mother." He paused, his steel-colored eyes holding hers without turning away. "But I won't use that as an excuse to absolve myself. Even though I didn't know, it was still my hand that signed those papers, and I can't deny that. I have to take responsibility for it." Della stood in silence, her eyes still shining with tears, but she was listening. "And when you learned the truth?" she asked, her voice cold, though no longer filled with the same fury as before. "What did you do?" Rourke remained quiet for a moment, then spoke again, his voice dropping. "When I discovered what had truly happened behind that warehouse, I couldn't sleep. I couldn't erase what had already been done. I couldn't bring back the people who had died, and I knew that no matter what I did, it would never be enough. But I quietly sought out every family of the victims and did whatever I could to make their lives a little less difficult, not to redeem myself, because some wrongs can't be redeemed, but because I couldn't go on living while ignoring what I had helped cause. I did it for years, in silence, without needing anyone to know, without expecting forgiveness." Della looked at him, and a fierce struggle unfolded inside her. Her heart, still aching from the betrayal, wanted to turn away from him and never look at him again, but her reason, hardened by years of suffering, forced her to judge the truth fairly. She thought about what he had just told her, about how he had been a young and inexperienced man manipulated before he had truly understood the power placed in his hands, before he had enough knowledge to realize he was being led into a trap. And she thought about the way he had spent years quietly trying to make amends without boasting, without seeking praise or recognition. Because if he had only been a hypocrite, he would never have done those things in the darkness, where no one could see him and offer admiration. Those two truths, that what he had done had been unintentional rather than deliberate, and that his remorse had been sincere and enduring through the years, slowly began to move her. She realized that if she allowed hatred to blind her to everything else, she would become unjust, and she would be no different from the people who had treated her mother so cruelly long ago. "I'm still hurting," she finally said, her voice quiet but honest. "And I can't pretend this never happened. But I believe you. I believe you didn't do it deliberately, and I believe your remorse is real. My mother was a kind woman, and I don't think she would want me to hold on to hatred until it poisoned me from within. So I choose to forgive you, not because you deserve it immediately, but because I don't want to become someone consumed by bitterness." Rourke looked at her, and an indescribable emotion rose in his eyes, a profound gratitude for the compassion of a woman whom life had treated so unjustly, yet who still possessed enough generosity to forgive. A silence settled between them after her forgiveness, a silence filled with relief yet still touched by hesitation, as though they were both carefully searching for a way across the abyss that had only just been bridged. Then Rourke, after a brief pause, seemed to decide that the time had come for her to know the whole truth, even though it might shake her heart once again. "There's one more thing I need to tell you," he said softly, and there was something almost uncertain in his eyes, something rarely seen in a man like him. "Something I kept from you, and I believe you have the right to know." Della looked up at him, a faint uneasiness stirring inside her. "Among the families I quietly sought out after learning the truth about that warehouse," he said slowly, "there was one family I watched over longer than all the others. A young woman struggling to raise her little brother, and later, a sick child of her own. I knew about the nights she stayed awake with worry, about the debts piling higher and higher, about the times she stood at the edge of collapse and still refused to fall." Della felt her heart begin to beat faster, and a vague premonition rose inside her, sending a chill down her spine. "Who are you talking about?" she whispered, though deep within herself, she had already begun to fear the answer. Rourke looked directly into her eyes. "I'm talking about you, Della." Her entire body seemed to freeze. "During the hardest years of your life," he continued, his voice gentle and thick with emotion, "when your daughter was ill and you didn't know where the money would come from, when every door seemed to close in your face, there were times when help arrived from somewhere you couldn't explain, weren't there? Money that came at the very moment you had lost all hope, without a name attached, without asking for anything in return." Della lifted one hand to cover her mouth, her eyes widening as old memories rushed back through her mind like a flood. She remembered the unfamiliar envelopes that had appeared beneath her door during the darkest nights of her life, the anonymous money that had helped her pay her daughter's medical bills and survive winters she had believed would destroy her. For years, she had wondered who that silent benefactor had been. So many times, she had prayed for that kind stranger, the person whose face she believed she would never know. "That can't be," she stammered, tears spilling once more, though this time they came from a shock too overwhelming to describe. "It was you? All those years? It was you?" Rourke gave a slight nod, and emotion shone in his eyes as well. "I carried the guilt of what my family had done to yours," he said. "I couldn't undo your mother's death, but I could quietly watch over you and do what was within my power to make life a little less painful for you and your brother. And later, for your daughter, I never intended for you to know. I didn't do it because I wanted your gratitude. I did it because my conscience wouldn't allow me to turn away. Then fate brought you into my hotel, and when you stepped forward to protect that boy that night, I had no idea that the courageous woman standing before me was the same person I had quietly watched over for so many years." Della stood there as an entire sea of emotion rose inside her, leaving her unable to speak. The man she had once resented for betraying her, the man she had only just forced herself to forgive through reason, was also the unseen hand that had pulled her back from the edge, again and again, during the darkest years of her life. The nameless benefactor she had thanked in her prayers for so long and the guilty man she had struggled to forgive were, in the end, the same human being. The irony and beauty of that truth made her want to cry and smile at once. She looked at him, at the lonely man who had silently carried a burden that wasn't entirely his and had tried to repair it in the only way he knew. And she felt something inside her heart, something she had believed had hardened long ago, begin to grow warm again. "So," she said softly, her voice trembling through her tears, "during the loneliest years of my life, I was never truly alone." Rourke didn't answer. He only looked at her, and in their eyes was a depth of understanding no words could ever express. The days that followed passed like a dream Della had never dared to dream. With all the sincerity of a man determined to repair the wrongs he had helped set in motion, Rourke quietly helped her rebuild her life, not through displays of wealth or gestures meant to make her feel indebted, but with the sensitivity of someone who understood that her dignity was the most precious thing she possessed. He arranged a decent, warm, and secure home for her and Toby. A place where, for the first time in many years, Della no longer had to lie awake worrying about the rent or the cold creeping through cracks around the door. He helped her find respectable work with a steady income, a job she could take pride in instead of one that invited others to look down on her. Most importantly, with stable housing and a clear source of income, the merciless clock counting down over Toby's fate finally stopped. Nora Bishop, with all her devotion, completed the final paperwork and told Della with a warm smile that no one could take Toby away from her now. The day Della held that official confirmation in her hands, she wrapped her arms tightly around her brother and wept, but this time, her tears were tears of happiness, the kind she hadn't tasted in far too long. She watched Toby happily arranging his glass marbles across the clean floor of their new home, his clear laughter echoing through the sun-filled room, and she felt as though an old wound inside her was slowly beginning to heal. During those rare days of peace, Della also began opening her heart more fully to Rourke. Together, they took Toby for walks in the park, sat quietly side by side while they watched the boy play. And between them, a tender affection slowly began to grow, built upon understanding and the wounds they shared. Yet even in those peaceful moments, Nora, guided by the instincts of someone who had witnessed too much injustice, quietly introduced Della to a woman she trusted, a tough and principled federal prosecutor who had long kept a watchful eye on the shadowy activities of the city's underworld powers. Nora didn't explain exactly why. She only told Della that should the day ever come when she needed true justice, this was the person she could turn to. Della didn't fully understand the meaning of that warning at the time, but she kept it close in her heart. Yet peace always comes at a price, and those whose pride has been trampled never remain still for long. When Camilla returned to her father's side, she poured fuel onto the hatred already burning inside Vito Renaud, and the powerful man, who regarded the broken engagement as an unforgivable insult to his family, finally decided to strike. Vito wasn't the kind of man who resorted recklessly to guns and violence, because he understood that some weapons were far more devastating. The Renaud and Castellano families had long been bound together by a tangled network of financial interests, legitimate business links on the surface upon which both sides depended, and Vito controlled the central link holding that entire system together. Then, just when Rourke believed he might finally begin a quieter chapter of his life, the storm arrived. One morning, Sal entered his office with a bloodless face and terrible news. Vito had moved without warning, tightening his grip and severing vital streams of money, freezing shared accounts, and within a single night, the powerful empire Rourke had spent years building began to sway on the edge of collapse. The men beneath him grew anxious. His partners began turning away, and for the first time in many years, Rourke Castellano faced the possibility of losing everything. He stood beside the window, looking down at the city awakening below, and understood that the war Camilla had threatened had truly begun. A war he was fighting not only for his power, but also for the woman and the boy to whom he had given his entire heart. That night, Rourke arranged for Della and Toby to stay in one of his secure buildings, a discreet residence on the outskirts of the city, where he believed they would be protected, while he struggled to deal with Vito's financial attack. But Camilla, whose hatred had sunk deep into her bones, refused to wait for her father to bring Rourke down through money. She wanted revenge that was more direct, more personal, and she knew exactly where Rourke's weakness now lay. It was late at night. Toby was fast asleep, and Della was sitting beside the window, looking into the darkness, when she suddenly heard unfamiliar noises rising from downstairs. Footsteps, whispers, sounds that didn't belong to the usual silence of the building. Her heart tightened. Guided by the instincts of a mother and an older sister who had spent her life on guard, she immediately carried the drowsy Toby into a concealed corner of the room, told him to remain there and keep silent, then quietly stepped outside to discover what was happening. Through the gap beside the staircase, she saw Camilla climbing toward her with several of her men, her beautiful face hardened with hatred beneath the dim light. Della immediately understood that they had come for her, and perhaps for Toby as well. Fear rose into her throat, but a strange calmness quickly took its place. She knew she couldn't fight them with physical strength. She was only a thin woman, while they were numerous and dangerous, but she possessed something they didn't: knowledge. Through all her years of cleaning, she had become an invisible person who quietly moved through countless buildings just like this one, and she understood them in a way no owner or powerful figure ever could. She knew every service passage, every emergency staircase, every dark corner, and where every corridor led. While Camilla and her people struggled to find their way through an unfamiliar place, The entire building existed in Della's mind like a map already committed to memory. She quietly returned, gently guided Toby through a side corridor she was certain they didn't know about, brought him to a small hidden room, and concealed him there safely, far from danger. Then, instead of escaping with him, she did something reckless. She went back, because she knew that if she simply ran, they would search the building and eventually discover Toby's hiding place. She had to draw them in another direction. Della deliberately made a faint noise at the far end of the corridor, loud enough for Camilla to hear, then slipped into the darkness. "The girl is over there," Camilla hissed, and the entire group rushed toward the sound exactly as Della had planned. She led them through the building's tangled turns and passageways, appearing and disappearing, always remaining one step ahead because she knew the layout by heart. She switched off every light whose controls she knew, plunging an entire section into complete darkness, leaving Camilla's men, already unfamiliar with the place, even more confused as they collided with one another, stumbled, fell, and lost all sense of direction. Della, meanwhile, moved quickly and silently like a shadow, because darkness was where she had lived for years, while to them, it was an enemy. At last, she drew Camilla, who had separated from her men in the heat of her fury, into a dead-end corridor Della had chosen in advance, a passage she knew had only one entrance and exit. When Camilla realized she had been trapped and turned around, she saw Della standing in the doorway, blocking her escape, holding a container of industrial cleaning solution she had quickly taken from a supply cabinet along the way. "Who do you think you are?" Camilla screamed, charging toward her in a frenzy. But Della was ready. She sprayed the stinging chemical directly at Camilla, forcing her to stop, cover her face, and stagger as her eyes burned. And in that instant of weakness, Della, drawing upon the speed and endurance of a woman accustomed to hard physical labor, closed the distance, used her own weight and a simple grappling move she had learned during the years when she had been forced to protect herself in poor neighborhoods, threw Camilla to the floor, and held her there. Camilla struggled and screamed in helpless rage, but she, a woman who had spent her entire life issuing commands and relying on the power of others, was no match for someone forged by endless hardship. At that moment, the sound of vehicle sirens and pounding footsteps filled the building. Rourke's men, whom he had sent the instant he learned what was happening, surged inside and subdued the remaining intruders. Rourke raced up the stairs, his heart seeming to stop with fear, and when he saw Della unharmed, standing there with Camilla restrained beneath her on the floor, he could barely believe his eyes. "Toby is safe," was the first thing she said to him, her breathing still ragged but her gaze unwavering. Rourke looked at the small woman before him, the woman who had faced an entire group alone and defeated them not with brute force, but with intelligence and courage, and a depth of admiration unlike anything he had ever felt rose inside him. Camilla's failed assault made Vito Renault realize that his hot-tempered daughter had gravely underestimated the woman who appeared so fragile, and that direct attacks would only make Rourke more vigilant, far more cunning and ruthless than his daughter. Vito understood that to break a person, one didn't necessarily have to strike at them directly. One only had to target what they loved most, the softest and most vulnerable place within their heart. And he immediately recognized that weakness in Della. Vito didn't resort to violence. Instead, he drew upon the hidden power he had spent years building, an intricate web of connections reaching deep into public institutions, people who owed him favors or whose secrets he controlled. With only a few telephone calls and several carefully placed words, he reopened the very nightmare Della had believed was finally behind her. One morning, just as Della had begun allowing herself to believe that life for her and Toby had finally become peaceful, a telephone call struck like a bucket of icy water. A cold, impersonal voice on the other end informed her that her guardianship of Toby was being reviewed, that new complaints had been filed, new questions raised about the legitimacy of the previous proceedings, and that officials were considering placing the boy in a state care facility while the entire matter was investigated again from the beginning. Della stood frozen, the telephone nearly slipping from her trembling hand. The merciless fear she had believed she had left behind forever, the countdown clock she had thought had finally stopped, suddenly came alive again, with greater cruelty than ever before. She immediately understood that Vito was behind it. He couldn't reach her directly, so he had reached for the one thing capable of bringing her to her knees, her right to remain beside the younger brother she loved more than her own life. Tears spilled from her eyes, but this time they weren't tears of resignation. They came from panic rising violently inside her chest. She hurriedly called Rourke, her voice breaking with fear as she told him about the call and the new danger hanging over Toby. But on the other end, Rourke's voice sounded strangely calm, and his words brought her racing heart to a sudden pause. "Della, listen to me," he said. "Toby is safe. The moment I discovered that Vito had begun using his influence inside public agencies, I anticipated this move. I had Toby taken to a discreet and secure location in advance, somewhere Vito's people can't reach. He is being cared for properly and is staying with people I trust completely. He is entirely safe. You have to believe me." Della clung to every word as a drowning person clings to a lifeline. "I want to see my brother," she said, her voice still trembling. "I need to see Toby." Rourke agreed immediately, and a short while later, when he took her to the safe house, she burst into tears of relief at the sight of Toby safe and peaceful, sitting on the floor and playing with his familiar glass marbles, which someone had thoughtfully prepared for him, his face calm and completely unaware of the storm gathering outside. He looked up when he saw his sister, and the corners of his mouth curved into the same clear, innocent smile. Della threw her arms around him and held him tightly against her chest, and in that moment she promised herself that she would never allow anyone to take away the last piece of family she had left. But she also understood that keeping Toby hidden was only a temporary solution. As long as Vito could manipulate legal procedures and overturn everything, the danger would remain, and she couldn't spend the rest of her life hiding. She wiped away her tears, and in her eyes, fear gradually gave way to iron determination. She would no longer sit quietly and wait for others to protect her. The time had come for her to stand and fight for herself. Then she remembered what Nora Bishop had once told her, remembered the federal prosecutor Nora had introduced, and an idea began to take shape in her mind. A man like Vito was accustomed to manipulating the law from the shadows, but perhaps only the law itself could bring him down. And Della began to realize that perhaps, just perhaps, she had been holding that very weapon in her hands all along without ever knowing it. In the days that followed, as Della sat quietly reviewing everything that had happened, she suddenly realized something she herself had never truly considered. Throughout all the years she had worked as a cleaner, moving silently through private rooms and deserted corridors, she had become a presence no one bothered to notice, a quiet shadow people had grown so accustomed to that they treated her as though she didn't exist. And because of that, they had spoken freely, held discussions, and left documents in plain sight without a second thought, because in their eyes, she was nothing more than furniture that could walk, someone who understood nothing and wasn't worth guarding against. But she had seen, she had heard, and with the sharp memory of someone who had always needed to remain alert in order to survive, she had unknowingly retained fragments of conversations, names, figures, and suspicious meetings she had witnessed while cleaning at the Castellano Hotel, things she hadn't understood at the time, but which now, when pieced together, began forming a picture so clear that it sent a chill through her. She realized that what she had witnessed were clues revealing how Vito Renault concealed his dirty money, how he moved it and made it appear legitimate through businesses that seemed respectable on the surface. She, the cleaning woman the entire world had dismissed, had become a witness to the very things Vito had fought so hard to bury. With her heart racing with new hope, Della immediately went to Nora Bishop, and through Nora, she met the federal prosecutor she had once mentioned, a stern woman with piercing eyes who had spent years pursuing underground powers like Vito, but had never possessed enough evidence to reach him. When Della recounted everything she remembered, the prosecutor was skeptical at first, but the longer she listened, the more her eyes began to brighten. The scattered pieces Della provided, when placed beside what investigators had quietly gathered over the years, suddenly fit together perfectly, filling the exact gaps the prosecutor had searched for so long. Within a short period of urgent work, and with Nora's devoted assistance, they assembled a complete case, one strong enough to bring Vito Renault into the light of justice. Meanwhile, believing victory was already his, Vito summoned a meeting of the city's underground powers, a gathering where he intended to publicly corner Rourke, display his strength, and force him into submission. Rourke attended, and to everyone's surprise, he brought Della with him. When she entered the room filled with cold, powerful faces, Vito looked at her with open contempt and let out a harsh laugh. "Is this your final card, Castellano?" he said mockingly. "An insignificant cleaning girl. What do you expect to do with something like this? What could she possibly know about our world? She has spent her entire life holding a cleaning cloth, a nameless nobody unworthy of my attention." Laughter spread through the room, and scornful gazes turned toward her. But Della didn't waver. She stepped forward and stood with her back straight amid the circle of powerful men. And when she spoke, her voice was calm and clear enough to silence every laugh at once. "You're right, Mr. Renaud," she said. "I'm only an ordinary cleaning woman. All my life, I've only known how to hold a cleaning cloth. And that is precisely why none of you ever paid attention to my presence. You spoke, you made plans, and you left papers directly in front of me, because you were certain that someone invisible like me would never understand and would never dare speak. But you were wrong. I saw everything, sir. I heard everything. And I remember it all." Vito's expression changed, and his arrogant smile slowly froze. "What nonsense are you talking about?" he growled, though a trace of unease had already entered his voice. Della looked directly into his eyes without the slightest hesitation. "The streams of money you believed you had hidden so carefully, the false businesses you created to make them appear legitimate. I witnessed all of it by accident while cleaning, because you never thought I was worth noticing. And now, everything I know no longer exists only inside my mind. It is already in the hands of people with enough authority to make you pay for it." The entire room fell silent beneath the weight of wordless shock. Vito shot to his feet, his face drained of color. "You're lying," he shouted. But at that exact moment, the door burst open, and the federal prosecutor stepped inside, followed by people carrying the full weight of the law. Vito Renaud, a man who had spent his entire life manipulating the rules from the shadows, now stood frozen as the empire he had built upon lies began to collapse, not beneath the gun of an enemy, but beneath the scraps of paper and memories of the very cleaning woman he had despised. What followed unfolded with a finality that even Vito Renaud, a man who had spent his entire life believing himself above the law, couldn't stop. The federal prosecutor stepped into the center of the room, and in a calm yet commanding voice, she began laying out everything the case had proven: the streams of dirty money, the fraudulent business fronts, and every link in the network Vito had spent so many years carefully concealing. Every statement she made was supported by evidence so solid that not even the most brilliant attorney could deny it. Vito's face changed from arrogance to panic, and finally to the complete collapse of a man who had realized that every path of escape had been sealed. He struggled, tried to call upon the powerful connections he had once relied upon. But this time, no one dared step forward to protect a man whose crimes had been exposed so openly beneath the light of justice. His entire empire, built upon lies and fear, the empire he had believed untouchable, collapsed not because of a bullet or a blade, but beneath the weight of the truth. And the most beautiful irony of all, the part people would continue to speak of for years afterward, was that the person who brought him down wasn't an equal rival from the underworld, nor some mighty and powerful force, but the very cleaning woman he had once dismissed with contempt as a nameless nobody who knew nothing. For all those years, powerful men like Vito had been so consumed with watching the rivals standing at their own level that they had forgotten about the quiet people beneath their feet and beside them, the people they had never once bothered to notice. They believed the invisibility of ordinary workers was proof of their insignificance, but they were wrong, because those invisible people, those whom the world treated as though they didn't exist, were often the ones who saw everything. Della had witnessed all the things those arrogant men believed were safely hidden, simply because no one had thought it necessary to conceal anything in front of a cleaning woman. Their contempt had become the weapon that destroyed them, and the smallest person in that room had proven to be the strongest. Not long afterward, Camilla, who had caused so much suffering and had personally taken part in the assault intended to harm Della and her innocent brother, was also forced to answer to the law for what she had done. The cold beauty and power that had once made an entire underworld bow before her could do nothing to save her when the time came to pay for her own crimes. The woman who had collected fear as though it were diamonds finally learned that there are things money and beauty can never buy, and that some people possess a resilience stronger than all the power in the world. As for Della, once Vito had fallen and his manipulative reach had been severed, every threat hanging over Toby's future disappeared with him. The suspicious complaints Vito had created to reopen the guardianship case were exposed as fraudulent, and no one could ever again interfere dishonestly in the lives of the brother and sister. Nora Bishop, wearing her familiar warm smile, personally brought Della the final piece of good news, that the legal right to care for Toby now belonged completely to her, securely and permanently, beyond the reach of any power that might try to take it away. The day Della held that document in her hands, she stood in silence for a long time, and all the years of suffering, all the sleepless nights, and every insult she had swallowed seemed to gather within that single moment before dissolving into tears of relief and happiness. She had survived it all, rising from an invisible woman the entire world had looked down upon, to someone who had reclaimed justice for her mother with her own hands, protected the brother she loved, and brought down a power that had seemed impossible to reach. Not through violence or hatred, but through her honesty, her resilience, and the dignity she had never allowed anyone to take from her. She looked up at Rourke standing beside her, and in his eyes, she saw not only love, but a profound respect, the respect he held for the woman who had taught an entire world accustomed to despising the weak a lesson none of them would ever forget. 6 months had passed since that fateful day, and the world around Della had changed in ways she would never once have dared to imagine. The Castellano Hotel, once a suffocating place ruled by dark laws and silent fear, had become something entirely different. Rourke, as though awakened by Della's love and the example she had set, had begun cleansing the shadows from his empire, severing corrupt dealings and guiding everything he had built toward more honest paths. But the clearest change, the one every employee could feel, was the way people were treated there. The workers who had once been regarded as furniture that happened to walk were now seen as real human beings, paid fairly, respected, and heard. There were no more Camillas waiting to humiliate them for pleasure, no more contemptuous stares or cruel words. Della, now standing beside Rourke, not as a cleaning woman but as the woman he treasured above all others, used her new position to do what her heart had always urged her to do. She established a foundation to support struggling workers, the invisible people society so often forgot, as well as disadvantaged children who needed a hand to lift them up. More than anyone, she understood what it meant to carry the weight of the whole world on thin shoulders, what it felt like to stand at the edge with no one reaching out, and she vowed that she would become that helping hand for others, just as an unseen hand had once carried her through the darkest winters of her life. The people who had once cleaned the endless corridors beside her now came to her not to beg, but to receive help as human beings with dignity, and each time Della saw hope return to a life because of her foundation, her heart grew a little warmer. Yet amid all those great changes, there was one moment that moved her more deeply than anything else. Toby, the boy who had once withdrawn into a world of his own and communicated with life only through glass marbles, arranged by color, had gradually grown accustomed to Rourke's presence. For months, the man who had once terrified the entire underworld had approached the boy with patience, never rushing him, never forcing him, only sitting quietly beside him each day and learning to enter his world according to Toby's own rhythm. He learned how to arrange the marbles by color, how to remain silent when silence was needed, and how to be present without demanding anything in return. Then, one afternoon, as soft golden sunlight poured through the window, something miraculous happened. Rourke was sitting on the floor with Toby, carefully placing a blue marble into its proper row, when the boy suddenly stopped moving. Toby lifted his eyes toward him, his clear gaze resting on the man's face, and then, slowly and naturally, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world, the boy placed his small hand over Rourke's larger one. The entire room seemed to fall silent. It was the first time Toby had willingly touched anyone other than his sister, the first time he had built a bridge of his own from the closed world inside him toward another person. Rourke froze, and the man with steel-colored eyes, the man who had faced countless dangers without wavering, now felt his throat tighten and his eyes begin to burn. He didn't dare move too quickly, afraid of shattering that fragile and precious moment. He only turned his hand over gently, allowing Toby's small hand to rest safely in his palm, and instead of pulling away, the boy gave him a clear, innocent smile. The smile Della had always cherished, now offered to him as well. Della stood in the doorway watching everything, and tears quietly filled her eyes. But they were the most beautiful tears she had ever shed. She saw the younger brother she loved more than her own life, the child she had fought with everything she had to protect, now smiling and placing his trust in the hand of the man who had become part of the small family she had always dreamed of having. In that moment, all the suffering, all the losses, and all the long, lonely nights she had endured suddenly seemed to carry meaning, because they had led her here, to this peaceful and complete moment, where a family once broken apart had been made whole again through love and patience. She stepped forward, sat down beside them, and the three of them quietly arranged the glass marbles by color beneath the warm afternoon sunlight, like a real family. A new year arrived once again, carrying with it the gentle chill of the first days of winter, and in the warm kitchen filled with morning sunlight in the house she could now truly call home, Della stood beside the wooden table, slowly preparing a cup of hot coffee. Steam rose from the cup and drifted into the air, and she smiled when she heard the familiar clicking of glass marbles coming from the next room, the sound of Toby playing, peaceful and happy. On a small shelf in the corner of the kitchen, carefully and respectfully displayed, rested the tiny pair of children's knitted shoes that had faded with the passing years. She no longer hid them inside her coat pocket like a wound she had to carry with every step. Now they were placed where she could see them each day, not as a source of pain, but as a gentle reminder of the little daughter she had once loved, of the love that had taught her to protect those who were vulnerable, and of the long journey she had traveled to reach this place of peace. She had learned how to live beside her loss, not by forgetting it, but by allowing it to become part of her strength. That wound had finally healed, not because time had erased it, but because she had found meaning within the pain itself. Lost in her thoughts, she suddenly felt a pair of warm arms wrap gently around her from behind. Rourke rested his chin on her shoulder, and in the tender stillness of the morning, they simply stood there together without saying a word, because there are moments when silence says everything. The man who had once made the entire underworld tremble had now found peace in this small kitchen, beside the woman who had taught him that true strength didn't lie in power or in the fear one inspired, but in kindness and the courage to protect what was right. And Della's story, the story of a cleaning woman the whole world had once looked down upon, left all of us with a profound lesson. A person's dignity is never measured by status or outward appearance, not by the clothes they wear or the work they do, but by the kindness, honesty, and unwavering strength within their heart. The quietest people, those the world treats as invisible, are often the strongest, and the ones who see everything most clearly. Kindness, even when it is trampled and dismissed, still possesses the power to change an entire world. And no matter how cruel life may become, as long as we don't lose ourselves, as long as we don't surrender our compassion and resilience, the light will eventually find us, and our wounds will one day be healed. If Della's story touched your heart, if it reached something deep within your soul, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so you can hear many more meaningful and captivating stories every day. We would truly love to know how you felt about this story. So which moment touched your heart the most? Please leave a few words in the comments below and share the honest emotions that came from deep within your heart, because we are always listening and deeply value every thought you choose to share. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story all the way to its final words. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful and peaceful life, and days filled with love. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the stories to come.